Hello.
Oh, are you kidding?
I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I'm Julie Gerberding. I'm moderating this incredible panel of experts whom you will soon meet. But I wanted to start by thanking Ken Frazier and Mike Rosenblatt for their leadership in helping this whole program come together. And of course, the whole pre-Galien team, but especially Claire Topol, who's really been helpful to us in putting our panel together. So thanks to everyone who's been contributing. We are going to be discussing the pipeline of science and how it gets translated into better health for people or not. But I wanted to start with a little bit of an overview because we're dealing in an environment here where just on this panel we have sort of a subset of the ecosystem of all the parts of the system that helps manufacture better health. We have the president of MIT, Sally Kornbluth, who's an academician and a scientist in her own right, a cell biologist. We have Dr. Steve Paul, who just told us in the back room that he's doing lots of things right now, but mostly he's starting companies. But Steve is a psychiatrist, neuroscientist who's had a stellar career as outlined in your program. But I'll come back to say a few more things about Steve in a moment. And then, of course, Dr. John Reed, who's the Executive Vice President for Innovation and Research and Development at J&J. But all of these people have been in various parts of the science ecosystem. Obviously, Sally right now is primarily in academia. She also has been in the lab. She's done a lot of science in her own right, spent time at Cambridge, has really had a stellar series of contributions, first at Duke University as provost and now, of course, at MIT. Steve Paul is an academician, still has a lab at Washington University in St. Louis, but also has served in large pharmaceutical companies in the role of head of research at Lilly, but has started several biotech companies, serves as the chairman of the board of the Foundation for the FNIH, the Foundation for NIH. I know him very well because he is my boss.
Hardly.
And then, of course, John Reed, who I think of as a senior executive par excellence, having been in several large pharmaceutical companies. But I think John has over 900 scientific publications, 150 patents, came out of the University of Pennsylvania, and has just been an incredible academician and scientist in his own right. So these individuals really cut across all of the different pieces of our ecosystem, the university side of things, the biotech side of things, the large pharma side of things. Steve's also on a third rock. He's in the investment community. So we have a number of perspectives here. And I think it's a great illustration of the virtuous cycle that we really need to keep this whole enterprise operating. That social enterprise is really built on two social contracts. Of course, the first one is the contract between the government and universities that emerged after World War II. Vannevar Bush and his call for the government to invest in research in our universities. The contract there is we'll spend taxpayer dollars on science, and in return, we will have a skilled workforce, we will have innovations that solve important problems, and overall prosperity will emerge. So that was a social contract that really caused the NSF to be founded and for the NIH to be increased and for a number of other government programs that support research to emerge through the years. The other social contract is, of course, the contract between, the implicit contract really, between the government and life science companies. And that contract is really based on the understanding that you will be able to profit from the collaborative investments that have been made in the research pipeline. In return, we will provide patent protection, appropriate market conditions, and the other enablers that allow you to prosper from those investments that you're making in the final stages of the R&D pipeline to a point, and then there will be an end to your patent, and your era of high profitability will decrease, and you will then make that more of a public good. Now, both of these are interlocking social contracts, and I think what we're experiencing right now is every part of them is under threat. And we were going to explore that in a little detail, but also think about, well, given the situation, what are the opportunities for resilience and what can we do to help alleviate some of this tension that everyone is experiencing? But before we do that, I want to start with something positive. So I'd like our panelists to maybe just reflect a bit on, from their standpoint, where have those social contracts really been good? Where's the big benefit that you see that we've gotten from this longstanding intersection between the government, taxpayers, universities, and life science companies? So I'll start with you, Sally.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to think about, and everybody in this audience knows this, is that the contract between the government and academia has enabled very, very long incubation time discoveries, if you will. I mean, everybody can rattle off, immunotherapy for cancer, drugs for HIV, et cetera, that took many, many years to develop. And I think, rhetoric now around moving all of R&D to companies is problematic, obviously. You all know that as well in terms of the long lead time and curiosity-driven research really being a driver. But the other thing I think people don't talk about a lot is the success in this partnership in driving a really vibrant workforce in this area. So, I like to say, would you get on a plane with somebody who'd never flown a plane before? I don't know, where people think that people learn how to do research and learn how to drive the ecosystem. And I think the way that graduate education has grown up in this country of people essentially being apprentices, learning how to do research before they go out into the world to either continue to do academic research or to go to industry, that whole training ecosystem has really been a success, of this contract.
Steve, what do you say?
Well, Julie, I think if you look at therapeutics, which I know many people in the audience are invested in, and you look over what's evolved over the last 30 years, the ecosystem that's evolved, academia, big pharma, biotech, patient funding, advocacy groups, the whole 9 yards, it's kind of amazing what has happened, what's occurred. If you look at the products being new medicines, new therapeutics, and I would wager that maybe 90% of all new medicines have emerged from that ecosystem. And I'm sure we could be critical of all the inefficiencies, and we might spend some time on that. But when I think about the stresses on that ecosystem, what I worry about is, will we lose what's been developed over the last 30 years? And I can tell you, I've had experiences, I was an academic for almost 20 years at NIH, intramural research program, lab chief, ran a big clinical unit, moved to Eli Lilly, where I spent 17 years, so another third of my career. Now I've been in biotech mostly for the last 15 years, and each element of that ecosystem, each of those elements is under some considerable stress right now, and I think we do have to be concerned about what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, but I think the strongest rationale for keeping it or evolving it even further, whatever the selection pressures are, is we don't want to go back. We've created some great therapeutics. I remind people that all patent-protected drugs become generic drugs, and they're really cheap. I don't want to give you my medical history, but I'm on atorvastatin, losartan, and you can name it. You get to my age, you got to reduce your cholesterol, and they're free. They're absolutely free, and they're great medicines. So we don't want to, tear down the house too much here. We're going to lose something that has benefited humankind in ways that, I think we all fully appreciate.
Yep.
Yeah, like Steve, I've had the honor and privilege to participate in different parts of this environment as an academic who ran labs funded mostly by NIH-funded research and by philanthropy, and philanthropy is an important component of this enterprise. Starting biotech companies, serving on the boards of biotech companies, and now 3 tours of duty at large pharma companies, now heading research and development for the innovative medicines pharmaceutical sector, J&J. I think, notwithstanding what's happening in China, the United States is the envy of the world when it comes to the biomedical research enterprise. The various dimensions of it and this virtuous cycle you've said has been critical to that. it's driven so much economic development. For example, in this country alone, there are 2.1 million people employed in the life science industry doing science. Just their personal income tax revenue is more than 5 times what the NIH spends. And then, to the extent that the, innovations out of academia can attract capital that, then actually results in an approved product, which happens, once in a blue moon, but it does happen. You have for-profit companies that are also paying taxes. And so, the return to what the government fueled is definitely represented many times over in the economic development that's generated as a result of this. And, much of the foundational element of that starts in academic institutions and universities funded by the government as a starting point that, can then attract capital. Now, the access to capital, though, is dependent on something else you mentioned, and that is rewarding innovation. As we know, until this AI frontier really comes to fruition that we just heard about, it's still a long journey and very capital intensive to make, for example, a new drug. Latest data I have say that if you start in the lab to try to make a development candidate, fewer than 1 in 10 projects work, and it costs an average of $125 million and takes 6 years. And then when you get a development candidate and you take it in the clinic across the industry, it takes 8.6 years to get to an approval, 2.6 billion, and your success rate is only 8%. So it's 1 in 12 actually make it. So it's a long, expensive journey, and if you don't have that reward for innovation at the end, there's just no way any business can justify making those investments. So that's an extremely important dimension to the whole enterprise that allows this to happen. As Steve said, eventually the patents expire. In this country, there are 33,000 approved generic drugs, more than 80% of which are available for less than $1 a day.
Amazing.
So,
Amazing.
and I also heard an interesting thing too, in this era of concern about healthcare costs, drugs are what keep people out of the doctor's office, they're what keep people out of the hospital. In a survey where people are asked, if you had to choose between your drug or your doctor, which would you choose? The vast majority took the drug.
Yeah.
Okay, is that right?
I don't know if I'd put that on the plus column or not.
And Julie, the probability statistics that John quoted haven't changed all that much in the last, call it 15 years. We did a benchmark. We wrote a paper in 2010 that some of you might have read, How to Improve R&D Productivity. And we looked at it was the top 13 drug companies that gave us confidential data, anonymous data, and we were able to work this all out. And those were exactly the statistics, and things haven't changed. Now, we've seen more drugs because I think we've seen more input, more companies, small, large company activities, but it's fundamentally one of the more difficult business propositions to partake in.
So, I asked ChatGPT, my friend, what are the aspects of the social contract with the public and the life science companies that have not worked well or that are being criticized. And what ChatGPT told me was that first and foremost is pricing and access crisis, the price of drugs, insulin, gene therapy, and drugs for rare diseases, the opacity problem, that data are not available, adverse event reporting is not transparent, and so on and so forth. That there's a private-public imbalance, benefits are privatized, foundational risks are socialized, and probably, broadly speaking, just the erosion of trust in the whole system. So what do you say to that? Do you think those are legitimate challenges to the system, or are people misunderstanding or misinformed?
I think there's definitely legitimacy, but I think also that the vast majority of Americans don't really know very much about how the enterprise works. And unfortunately, of all our healthcare costs, the out-of-pocket piece has been, laid on prescription drugs as one of the areas. One of the things that's very unique about the U.S. citizen, as we probably all know, but most Americans don't, is the cost to distribute the drugs is astronomically higher in this country than it is anywhere else. So any other country where they have single healthcare payer systems, from the time the drug leaves the manufacturer till it gets to the patient, there's only a 5 or 10% additional cost. In this country, it's 60%. So 58 cents on every dollar is going to middlemen who are not contributing to R&D, they don't assume any liability. So it's a perversion of the U.S. system that, you know, if you could fix that, you could cut drug prices in half right there. So, but most Americans just don't understand that, and most people, I think, also who are making these policy decisions are maybe not giving as much attention as it probably deserves to see if we could do that more efficiently. So that's certainly one dimension. On the safety thing and adverse events, I mean, my gosh, in the post-marketing vigilance, in fact, our head of epidemiology is here, who does all that work with real-world data. You know, we're tracking every side effect that shows up, and it all goes in database, and it all gets reported to the FDA, and so there's complete transparency around those issues. So
I think so when I watch those
again, I think
television
people
ads.
just don't understand what the commitment is. You know, getting a drug approved, that's just the beginning of your, you know, of the investments you have to make to actually market and maintain that. So the post-marketing pharmacovigilance is substantial.
Yeah. You and I talked, Sally, a little bit about the similar criticisms, whether they're founded or unfounded, the university public side of the contract, the concern about elitism, geographic maldistribution, the high cost of college education and so forth. How do you respond to those perspectives?
Well, you know, one interesting thing is actually most of the criticisms are being leveled at the educational side of the house, not at the research side of the house. Americans, by and large, really support research, and they see the pipeline to drugs that are going to improve their lives and other technologies. But what's been interesting is, though, the research enterprise is what's been sort of put at risk because research funding from the government has been so critical. The other thing, though, I think is important to think about is higher education is so incredibly heterogeneous. So look, we hear complaints and concerns which are legitimate about access and affordability, about employment following graduation, about culture on campus, and I'm not going to say that higher education is perfect. Believe me, we have things we need to work on. But again, the heterogeneity means that we each respond in different ways. So for instance, at MIT, any family under $200,000 a year income gets free tuition. So 87% of our students graduate with no debt at all. And the remaining group has less than 20K debt for all 4 years cumulatively. So when we hear access and affordability concerns, they're very different for us than from some sectors. Similarly, you know, when we think about things like, you know, taxes on our endowment, people think, oh my God, you have so much money. Why does the government have to give you money? So our endowment is used, first of all, for all that financial aid, and second of all, to match almost dollar for dollar what we get from the federal government to conduct research, because the research actually costs more than the money we receive. You know, I hate to use really silly sounding analogies, but like if someone comes, you know, we get money to do specific projects. It's not just the university is taking money. We get money, we do the work. So, you know, if a painter comes to paint your house, you don't decide whether to pay them or not based on how much money they have in the bank. You know, we are taking money to do specific projects. We are adding value, both in terms of the talent that we bring to the table and in terms of real dollars and facilities, et cetera. And so I think the criticisms are leveled in one direction, and another piece of the enterprise, you know, is suffering to some extent. Now, with respect to elitism, I think part of it, and this comes to John's comment about maybe people not really understanding the pipeline, I think we have not been as good as we need to be at explaining what we do and how we do it. And honestly, it's not easy because, you know, we joke on campus that there are even, you know, we have people on our campus who don't really understand how the endowment works and how research funding works, et cetera. Never mind people who are never touched by any of these things. So I think the anti-elitism piece reflects a general distrust in institutions, and we have to really explain continually the value we bring, how we bring it, and really what we're doing in very specific terms that are much more accessible.
And I have a personal perspective that that's not just limited to the Northeast or the West Coast, that this is a problem across our entire academic system. I am the child of two parents who went to South Dakota State University, which is a land-grant college, and even in that environment, the tuition has gone up substantially. There's a sense that that university is not benefiting the people in South Dakota in the way that it was originally designed to do, that the advances in agriculture are not resulting in better quality of life for the farming community and so forth. So, you know, it's a whole problem of how we communicate the value of education, but also what are the expectations of what will happen. I mean, right now, Steve and I struggle from the conversations going on in Washington that somehow it's the NIH's fault that there's a gap in mortality and morbidity in the United States. Well, you know, is it a failure of research? Is it a failure of pharma? Is it a failure of the university? Or is it a failure of the way we bring care to people, create affordable access, and deal with health policies on a larger scale, or all of the above? And you know, I think increasingly when you think of it as a systems problem, you recognize we all have a piece of that. Exactly. But it's not really fair to punish the NIH because there's a gap in the morbidity and mortality in the United States. Let's figure out how we can leverage that talent to be part of the solution. Steve, you want to?
Well, I sort of to back up, I hear all the complaints, whether it's complaints about academia or pharma or biotech. It's an opportunity to reflect on what we can do better, to be honest with you. So again, I can say this after being in big pharma. I do think pharmaceutical companies, do play a role in pricing and access, and they can be more creative, and we've seen that recently. I don't know if there are any Lilly colleagues in here, but capping the price of insulin at $35 a month is a good thing. It's fundamentally a generic drug.
If you can get the formularies to carry it.
Yeah. They're all big parts of the ecosystem. You mentioned, you didn't say PBMs, but you mentioned the challenge. And I think it's an opportunity because pricing and access is really, I think, the big thing. I mean, I take some non-generic drugs too, and occasionally I go to the pharmacy and whoa, $400. That's a lot of money for, and so, there are real issues. I keep reminding people that the worst outcome could be no access to new medicines at all, right? If we create too many disincentives, we tear down this ecosystem or the elements that have created the environment we're in. Who's going to come up with that drug for Alzheimer's that really slows progression? I mean, if we don't, the public health consequences of that are really substantial. Obesity drugs are very expensive. When you start looking at the healthcare savings, it's absolutely astounding if you think about what they could do. Now, can people get those drugs? Can underserved populations get those drugs? Those are some real issues, and I don't have the answers. I don't know if anybody has the answers, but it's a time to reflect and say, okay, how do we make this happen?
And there's a lot of doing this, pointing at the other piece of the puzzle. I think one of the things that we talked about in preparation for this conversation was the fact that there are some things that everyone in this room, no matter what your particular role in health and research is, that there's some things that we can all rally around, and one of them has to be the importance of academic research, that we need the whole community to stand strong on why research needs to be funded and nourished so that it can continue to feed that pipeline into biotech, into pharma, into translation, into new medicines, and hopefully into uptake and access.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but one thing that you mentioned, the compact between the government and academia and the government and industry. I think we are working much more to kind of close that triangle and have many more interactions between academia directly and industry in seeding the pipeline, because I think we have to find new models to move forward if the pipeline is going to dry up in other ways. And we're experimenting with all sorts of things.
And that's what we want to move to now is so we have this kind of fragile virtuous cycle. It's under stress. I would say since many of the new executive orders have come out, it's probably in crisis. In at least many of the people I interact with experience it that way. And so we can wallow in the crisis, but crisis is a good crucible for innovation. So I know everyone here is thinking about, well, given this, what is a better solution? What's a better way? So let's talk about that. You know, what are you doing at MIT to help move beyond this current, what's your resolve to resilience?
Right. No. So, I mean, you know, look, it's going to be a combination of things, obviously. And, you know, we obviously are ramping up philanthropy, et cetera. But with respect to industry, you know, we're trying a number of different models. I think we've had, you know, years and years of just sort of traditional sponsored research from industry, individual deals, or even master agreements. But I think we're thinking much more of how we do things that are really win-win for academia and industry. So, for example, we're doing a lot more consortia. So, for instance, we have a Gen AI consortium where a number of companies have now put in some money, but what they get is the ability to ask questions that they want MIT researchers to work on. In other words, it's not a direct, you know, one-to-one correspondence, but they are forming a community that then works with our AI community to help define the questions that are going to be most important to those industries. So it's not a per project, it's more like a membership kind of thing. We're doing a lot more interaction with industry where they're interested in collaborations that otherwise might not take place. So, for example, Analog Devices in Boston has just seeded a collaboration between Mass General Brigham and MIT. And we asked for proposals from faculty that really would ask fundamental clinical questions at the get-go of the projects and pair them with our AI and device people so that we would get right away to things that could eventually be products. I mean, it still helps us do our basic science, but it's basic science with a long-term goal in mind. The other thing I think we're seeing a lot from industry, I mentioned the graduate ecosystem, same with the postdoc ecosystem. If industry is interested in helping us, but is not interested in just, you know, doling out money for the projects we're interested in, which of course we would never say no to, the talent development pipeline, we're working a lot more with industry. So we're seeing a lot more companies willing to sponsor graduate fellowships, postdoc fellowships for individuals who are interested in then doing internships in those companies, interacting very actively during those companies in the, you know, pursuit of their project goals, et cetera, so that at the end of the day, the companies are having a first look at talent that may really benefit them as well. So we're trying really experimentally a number of different ways that we can engage that aren't really just the traditional, give us money, we'll give you IP or what have you. In order to kind of develop a richer menu of opportunities to have an interaction. And we'll see what's successful going forward. But we're open to all sorts of models. And honestly, individual companies put forth different models that would optimize their interaction with our scientists.
Julie, let me mention a couple of ideas, really models that have occurred recently, I think may help solve some of the pressures. And you know these well. I'm going to toot the horn of what we do at the Foundation for the NIH. So what we do and what we're mandated to do by Congress is to forge public-private partnerships, bringing together the elements of the public sector ecosystem and the private system. And two that I think have been, you know, really very impactful, and there's been many more. The Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, which I was fortunate enough when I was at Lilly to get started with some other colleagues. The National Institute of Aging, very involved in Alzheimer's research. We had very few biomarkers in those days to diagnose patients with Alzheimer's accurately. Turned out about 30% of patients that were getting into our clinical trials didn't have Alzheimer's disease. Well, that's a lot of noise in the system if you're trying to develop a therapeutic. So initially it started really as, you know, structural MR, you know, looking at brain atrophy and degeneration over time from normal, healthy, elderly people to people who had the prodrome, mild cognitive impairment, to people who had AD, and following them longitudinally. John Trojanowski, who you may remember from Penn.
You remember him, God bless
John
him.
insisted that we put in some blood and CSF biomarkers, that we collect these samples. And if you fast forward, and by the way, we had, contributions, financial contributions from NIH. NIA put in a good part of the money. About half the money came from industry, mainly large pharma companies, but we took money from anybody who could contribute in those days. We spent about a year wrangling over who would own the IP, and we finally, got the lawyers all to agree who would own the IP. Nobody would own the IP. People thought of it as pre-competitive. By the way, as it turned out, it became pro-competitive, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So we ended up, after 25 years, and by the way, thousands, it was all data put in the public domain. Anybody could access it. People who knew nothing about Alzheimer's could analyze the data. Several thousand publications have come out of this thing. A really interesting way of thinking about group science in a way. And if you fast forward to 2025, what the imaging biomarkers did, because they're not actually necessary anymore, because the blood-based biomarkers work really well, they validated the blood-based biomarkers. And in a really interesting sort of outcome was there are probably a half a dozen now diagnostic companies that are using these blood-based biomarkers. So it became pro-competitive. They could use the data and they could commercialize. They have different types of products that they sell. And so now, literally, and it's kind of an amazing thing that's occurred only the last couple of years, you can go in and get a blood test. And now, you've got to be careful about what you do if the test is positive, but you can tell whether you've got early Alzheimer's, and you can monitor progression of the disease. This is really incredibly important for the clinical trials that are underway. So that's an example, I think, of what none of us could do alone. Yeah, ADNI, the Alzheimer's disease imaging.
I think it illustrates a couple things. One is the value of the wise crowd of people. Universities are very involved in this, as the coordinating center at UCSF and so forth. The duration of the time that it took to pull this together and the incredible learning that occurred over the course of that time. It's now a global network, so it's
it's gone all over the world. It's incredible.
It's still going.
Yeah, and we've tried to emulate it a bit with another program that we started there called the Accelerating Medicines Partnerships, the AMPS. And I have to give a shout out to Francis Collins, who really was the driver behind that. But we took various therapeutic areas, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, brought together the best and the brightest from academia, the best and the brightest from industry, very focused on new biology, new targets, and again, all sort of pro-competitive, depending on how you want to look at it, because the idea was, what do we work on? How much more can we learn about disease biology that will enable therapeutics?
And open access to the data,
open
which is
access
absolutely critical.
So anybody who's got a computer, wherever they are in the world, they get access to the data, and there are a lot of smart people that interrogate the data and come up with some amazing things. And now with AI, who knows what will happen. So anyway, those are just a couple of examples of,
I think the partnership model is really important. This porosity between industry and academia is also a thing, and I know J&J's been long at that, but you want to talk about it from the industry side?
We've, like many companies, have been participants in some of these public-private partnerships, like the Accelerating Medicines Partnership in this country, or the IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe. One recent one that I like to tout is J&J scientists partnered with the Gates Foundation to organize this global neurodegenerative proteomics consortium, the GNPC. And several Nature papers just came out of that, but that's the world's largest proteomics database devoted to neurodegenerative diseases.
beautiful data, by the way, that really is focused on neuroinflammation, a new set of targets.
I was going to raise that, but this initiative, we recruited a number of academic institutions to also join. 250 million proteomic measurements are in the database, now available to the public. And it'll serve as a long-term resource. But one of the insights that came out of it is really the importance of neuroinflammation, particularly showing that ApoE4, which has the strongest genetic link to Alzheimer's, the typical late onset adult Alzheimer's, that that imparts a pro-inflammatory signature that's seen both in the blood and the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, that begins early in life, way before you have the neurodegeneration. But it really pointed to the importance of neuroinflammation in the pathogenesis of the disease. And it also showed that ApoE4 and that proteomic signature is also found not just in Alzheimer's, but also this pro-inflammatory signature that you can see in the proteome is found in Parkinson's and ALS and frontal temporal dementia. So it really suggests that neuroimmunology is a place we should be spending a lot of effort to try to figure out how to tackle these really challenging neurodegenerative diseases. So, it's just as one example. We're also very active in some of the stuff in the UK where they've leveraged their healthcare system. I wish we could do more of that in this country, but they've been very proactive with the Biobank, UK Biobank. We're involved in an initiative there called Global Minds, which is in mental health, where they're tracking longitudinally 50,000 patients, electronic health records, that all these patients have mental health disorders of some sort, full sequence genome, proteome, et cetera. And through this, together with AI, hopefully we get some new insights how to really understand some of the heterogeneity of those diseases, how to match the right medicine to the right patient, find some new targets, et cetera. So
I think
a lot of those kind of things, I think, are one dimension. I did want to say, though, that I think there are a couple other things we could be leveraging or things that we could work on. You mentioned intellectual property and how that was holding things back. I do feel there's an opportunity there, which we'd have to have government, IRS is a collaboration, but 501c3 nonprofits have limitations on when they do joint research. Say they're doing joint research sponsored by a pharma company, a for-profit company, and IP gets generated. By IRS regulations, the nonprofits have limitations on how much rights they can give already to the nonprofit who's funding the research. Usually you can just get a right at first negotiation. They can't necessarily pre-negotiate what it would cost to actually buy the IP. So if you're a company and you're looking at sponsoring this research, there's a lot of ambiguity around, can you get the IP that results and what would you have to pay for it? So if we could come up with a more collaborative way to handle that, I think it would allow for more joint research. So that's one area to work on. And then the other I've seen be very effective is what I would call incubators, where you can have staff that have 1 foot in the university and 1 foot in a company. Certainly at J&J, we've been pioneers in this with this J-Labs concept. We have 14 of those around the world that provide places where people can just rent a bench and put 2 or 3 people in there, and you've got all the infrastructure you need, but you can do it now outside the university in a separate environment from indirect costs of NIH and things. But it's often done with scientists whose idea was born in a university, and that it has an opportunity to now flourish and gets tracked capital in a for-profit environment.
These ideas that have been something that were talked about by the NIH leadership in the past couple of years, and we were involved in trying to understand the porosity between industry and the NIH and academia. Particular emphasis on graduate and postdocs because of the existing problem paying postdocs a living wage, and also the duration of time before a postdoc actually becomes an R01 funded investigator, and it's a long time to live like a student. So it's a big challenge. So there are lots of these models where different for-profit organizations are funding fellowships, sometimes bi-directional, where someone from industry will embed in a discovery lab to get a feeling for that. Scientists in the academic environment aren't always tuned into what's really involved in drug formulation and moving some good idea into something that actually is a product that meets all the toxicity criteria, et cetera. But nothing is scaled. And now we're in a bit of a crisis where we've got the university that I'm most familiar with has a 30% reduction of graduate students going into the training this fall. 30% reduction. That's a huge hole in the training, and I think that's not unique to that particular university. And then the other little shocking piece of information was shared with me from the Trailblazer Prize winner, a physician science award that FNIH gives. The scientist is at Cornell, and he was describing how he has a very prestigious lab. He's used to having 100 or so people contact him internationally every month for opportunities for training in the lab. That has trickled to 2 or 3 a month. So what used to be a magnet has now become a repulsion. And that's something that, what we're doing right now to try to increase the connectivity between industry and academia is not going to solve that unless we can figure out how to really scale it. And what is the responsibility for industry in helping to make sure that this pipeline is not just a pipeline of discovery, but it's a pipeline of talent?
Yes.
I think you raise a good point. I once did a search on Nobel laureates in medicine physiology, and since World War II, something like 85% of those were won by scientists working in America, but fewer than half of them were actually born in America.
Yeah.
And we all know that we just have the talent supply line in this country for science and technology and mathematics. Talent is not what it needs to be, and we all know the statistics of how poorly the U.S. ranks in terms of our public schools, in terms of generating that science and mathematics competent talent. So that's something that we also need to someday do something about. But that's sort of, the problem starts there, and why the country is so dependent on sourcing science and mathematics and engineering talent from elsewhere. It's interesting that, we just had a session on AI. The head of almost every one of the AI companies came from some other country and came here to do a fellowship and never left. So it really just illustrates the criticality of being able to import talent.
I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, we have a pretty robust pipeline of graduate students, obviously, from abroad, but this notion of how you get more American talent into the pipeline is also really important. And so we've actually come, I wouldn't say reluctantly, but kind of carefully to the notion that places like MIT have to now get in the business of K-12 education in one way or another. So, we're just starting a program just with pilots, sort of MIT for America. We're fleshing it out, but some of it involves going to high schools, training teachers, et cetera, in calculus. 50% of the high schools in this country don't teach calculus. You can't come to MIT if you don't have calculus. You won't be able to pass the classes. Same with, linear algebra. I mean, a lot of the foundational math in particular is just not available. So what is our role as an institution in trying to make access greater? Now, I talked about access and affordability. We can provide dollars, but we can't provide the foundational education across the country, and we have to somehow, be involved in stimulating that, or we're going to have a continued problem in terms of populating, the pipeline with American students.
Yep.
Yeah,
I don't know if we need more of, I don't know if George Yancopoulos here, but I think he went to like the Bronx School of Science or something, which was a high school that specialized in science and math, and
Many
I don't know if we
Nobel
need more of those kind of things where we just, for that. The other thing I was wondering, why don't we just give like tuition forgiveness or something to people who will major in a STEM,
Well, 97% of our majors are
Yes, it's
STEM
not,
majors.
it's not a problem at MIT. But, at other universities, if we could get more people to commit to careers with that kind of, educational foundation, it certainly might be a step in the right direction.
Well, one way of thinking what you're talking about is, do we need to rewrite these social contracts to be more mindful of these broader issues that we're struggling with right now? And if that's going to happen, who should do it? Any volunteers? And I'm serious in a sense, like, it's easy to think, oh, we should do this, but then who will do that, and how do we collectively advocate if it's a policy change or a congressional decision or a state-to-state opportunity? We have to figure out how to link what we need to the advocacy and the mechanisms to drive it forward.
Yeah.
But you're now touching, the societal issues around immigration, okay? Because we, as an industry, John mentioned this, not just biopharma, but high tech in general. I mean, if you think of the impact of immigrants, whether they be first generation or second generation or whatever. I mean, it's just been enormous. And if that shuts down.
I know.
And so I think if we advocate for our industry, we have to advocate for reasonable policies around immigration. And what we're seeing is an acute issue, but if that becomes a chronic issue, we're in trouble. We're in trouble.
We haven't had a lot of, joint collective action, I have to say. I think this is one thing academia, talks about. First of all, we have our own collective action issue, which is academia together, but it's academia with industry has been an issue. So, if we see ourselves as the pipeline, the issues that are hitting us are going to impact you later, kind of thing. And thinking about how we articulate the need for this pipeline, I think collectively is really important.
And the other trend that's a little bit worrisome is this trend of repatriation. We're seeing like reverse immigration, and that could be pretty devastating when you think about the demographics of the scientific workforce in this country. These are folks that, if they find better places to work and they happen to be in Beijing or wherever, they're going to go there, and that's going to have a real consequence.
British institutions are
British,
being inundated.
French,
Yeah.
I think the other issue is, putting my global hat on, is that, most of my workforce is not in the United States. It's actually overseas somewhere. And so you go where the talent is. And so I think it's, we're agnostic about geography to some extent, right? So if the talent's not here, we'll go find it somewhere else.
So one of the real challenges we haven't touched on, you mentioned it briefly, Sally, and that is that public trust in what we're all doing is not, shall we say, at an all-time high. And, the importance of being able to tell the story better, to be transparent about how does discovery lead to good health in a community. That story comes out piecemeal and is often driven by somebody's particular agenda or particular, lobbying interest, for lack of a better word. So is there some kind of a more coordinated way that we could collaborate on getting the whole story told in a way that helps people at least start from a common understanding of what's going on here? Because try to explain a PBM to someone. It took me about 3 years to understand it. So, these are really tough concepts, and people don't really understand what is necessary for them to be able to get what they want, which is access to the new things that science is creating.
Well, it's even more complicated than that because, first of all, we all used to have a single news source or very few news sources. And the other thing is that the multiplicity of news sources has led to a lack of distinction between fact and opinion. So it's very difficult when everybody can weigh in and those facts, opinions, whatever, receive sort of equal weight. And when people are tuning into the, news source that resonates most with their inherent beliefs to begin with. And that's the whole political spectrum. I wouldn't lay that on one side of the political spectrum and another. I think it's true across the board. And so we get greater polarization, and without a way to make the case in some sort of unified way, it's difficult. I think, there are a couple of avenues. One is, I think, patient advocacy groups, I think, are very important. That cuts across, socioeconomic groups. It cuts across different parts of the country. That's one way. The other way is really, it's almost like hand-to-hand combat with human interest stories. Everyone has someone in their family who was touched by cancer or touched by Alzheimer's, or we have to have a much more emotional ground game, I think, than simply making an intellectual case, because people, it just is not resonating with people.
I would say the same thing holds for the pharmaceutical industry. I honestly have been thinking about this for over 30 years, and maybe John has a solution, but we make these amazing medicines, we do these great things for people, and when they poll people, we're just maybe a little bit above the tobacco companies, but on a good day. And I chaired the S&T committee at Pharma for a number of years, and we meet, and how do we stop this? You know, how do we get on the side of the angel, so to speak? And I've not really come up with an answer, maybe, but I do think patient advocates, I think better storytelling about what our medicines can do for people will help. But it's been a chronic problem. Frankly, you know, I think academia is now, you know, relatively new. I don't recall people being that critical of academia, you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but pharma is almost from the very beginning. So I think we're all in it together, kind of this mess together, and we've got some, you know, reputational repairing. But I don't know, John, what are your thoughts?
I think you're on the right track here, Sally and Steve, around the patient stories. That's what I think really, that's, you know, this is why we do what we do. It's everything begins and ends with the patient. And just making that the center and being able to tell those stories and humanize more of what we do, I think is where it should go. As a scientist, I would love if there's also more a little bit of the really cool science that underlies this, because when you know, even as a layperson, if you can understand mechanistically, like, you know, a bispecific T-cell engager that grabs the cancer cell with one arm and grabs the T-cell, the immune cell with the other, and gets the immune cell fighting. I mean, that's cool stuff, you know.
It is.
You know, you would think that, you know, this would get people more excited and thinking in a more positive attitude about,
especially if you had cancer, right?
Well, you know, it's obviously a challenge in lots of sectors, but I think it's really compounding some of the things that are going on for us right now, because we don't really have an obvious place to turn to look for allies outside of our enlightened self-interest. I wanted to make sure that we included in this conversation, Steve has a role in philanthropy. You know, we are a philanthropic organization at FNIH, and we're maybe overlooking the potential for philanthropists to play a bigger role in part of this equation as well. You know, many of you are aware that there's going to be a gigantic wealth transfer in the next 15 or 20 years as the people who are, you know, the high wealth individuals today pass their wealth on to their boomer children or their post-boomer children. And that next generations have very different concepts about what constitutes a good use of money. And one of those good uses is social impact. We're all driving for a certain kind of social impact here, so this might be another opportunity for us to kind of collectively think about how do we engage another leg of the stool. So it's not just government, you know, it's not just industry, but we're really looking for being able to engage philanthropic support. And along those lines, some of you may be familiar with the Health Research Alliance, but there's, you know, a kind of a, I don't want to use the word trade association, but an organization that supports research organizations that are not institutional based. So things like the American Cancer Association is a big one, but there are also small ones, and the amount of money that they're putting into the academic, particularly for fellowships and young investigators, is escalating substantially. They're harvesting a lot of this philanthropic interest, but that's someplace that we need to be thinking about how to engage and align so that we can really build a stronger constituency. The great thing about that is most of them are patient-derived organizations, so it kind of feeds into that opportunity for storytelling and amplification as well. So we're very close to the end of our time, and I really could talk with you for a lot longer, but I think, you know, we've been trying to explore what's happening in the vicious, not vicious cycle, feels kind of vicious at the moment, the virtuous cycle that we're experiencing, and what we might be able to do long-term to help reframe it. And maybe that's just the start of a conversation, and it'll come up at various times during the organizational meeting today and beyond. But these are really wise leaders who have had a profound influence on availability and quality of science and the good things it can do for people. So let's thank them. Thank you.